my privilege to be with you all tonight. Ko Stacey Morrison tōku ingoa. I'm Stacey Morrison, no Aotearoa, no Ngaitahu. Those are my iwi. And to open the incredible women that we have joining us here tonight, I wanted to make sure that our space is energized. And so I'm offering a karakia that recognizes all of the energy from above, from below, from within, and from all of us that we are offering as we come together tonight. Tu tawa mai runga, tu tawa mai raro, tu tawa mai roto, tu tawa mai waho. Kia tau ai te Māori tū, te Māori ora, ki te katoa. Haumi e, hui e, tae ki e. So when we talk about diversity in the workplace, sometimes people think about the differences that we can see, so they're racial or the ethnic or their gender. But actually diversity, as we know, encompasses so much more than that. It can be culture, it can be religion, gender, sexual orientation or identity. It can be disabilities, body type, age, background. You're getting the idea. There are lots of different things, and probably each of you have something that you identify with strongly. Now, when we talk about diversity, research has shown that actually when we embrace our diversity, it enhances creativity, innovation, emotional intelligence, and ultimately productivity. And I know as a mother, it's something that I really do look at in terms of my parenting and nurturing and my children to understand and value diversity. So how do we do this? Because it's not always natural. So we're very lucky to have our panellists, New Zealand's first Professor of Diversity, Edwina. Thank you so much for joining us. Founder of Authenticity Aotearoa, Nurain Janah, and Disability Rights Commissioner, Paula Tesoriero. Tēnā koutou katoa. Thank you all so much for joining us. May I start with you, Edwina? If people have been able to overcome the beauty of your background, what would you describe as some of the benefits of diversity and inclusion?
Kia ora, mai no tātou katoa, ko Edwina pio tāku inoa. He tangata te riti aho, no reira, tēnā tātou katoa. I think the benefits of diversity really refer to the fact that all of us are different. All of us bring different skills, competencies, and beauties, including different kinds of conflict to what we do. And that creates innovation and spaces for growth, for development, for aesthetics, for music. I mean, if all of us were clones of each other, how boring would life be? So diversity is something that's beautiful. It's a beautiful accountability that belongs to each and every one of us.
I like that word accountability. Let's come back to that. And Paula, what would you describe as some of the benefits of diversity and inclusion?
Kia ora tātou, ko Paula Tesoriero tōku ingoa. I think it's a great way to start this kōrero, and for me the benefits really are very varied. So first of all, you get that ability to really hear a different variety of perspectives, and I think that that ultimately can lead to better decision making, innovation, engagement in terms of employee engagement, stakeholder engagement. I think if you're a diverse organisation, then you're more likely to be able to respond to the needs of those you serve or your customer base. Problem solving is enhanced. And I think from a disability perspective, disabled people are great problem solvers because there are so many barriers that we have to navigate on a daily basis, and so problem solving is something that just comes naturally. And so when you embrace disability in an organisation, then you get that real problem solving capability. And I think ultimately it really just encourages and allows a space for everyone, and a space where different ideas can come to the fore, and those different ideas hopefully mean that better outcomes and innovations are produced.
Nurain, what would you like to add to that in terms of the benefits that you see and experience?
Kia ora, assalamu alaikum, ko Nurain taku ingoa. Absolutely, adding on to both what said, for me it's really about bringing together people and being able to each of us feel really included and be ourselves. I think that really creates the like we've all said, it's the diversity of our personalities, our perspectives, but really being able to be included and feeling like we belong. That belonging, I think, is the richness of a society like New Zealand, especially because I think we have a real opportunity here to I guess test out what it looks like to have a truly multicultural environment. So for me, the benefits of diversity is that belonging and feeling like we can all show up and be ourselves.
I like how all of you have further defined diversity as you answered that question. And Edwina, I think the point that Nurain makes about feeling included is really important, perhaps something hard for companies to define. So what are some of the barriers that you've seen that companies find hard to overcome when looking at offering more diversity and helping people feel welcome?
I think people are nervous of diversity. They are not sure what they should do with it. And they know that they need to include it, but they are not sure how to do it. And that's really the crux of the issue. Furthermore, a number of issues have been highlighted by our New Zealand media as well as internationally. And I just want to hold up a book that's, I mean, you can't really see the book, but it's called Faith-Based Violence. So people are concerned about violence brought about by different faiths, whether one thinks of the Crusades, whether one thinks of what happened in Christchurch. So people are not sure what to do, and therefore sometimes they pander to diversity without really looking at the benefits, as you asked the first question, that diversity can bring. And I think therefore organizations really need to have policies and practices which they can implement, which they measure, and which are not toothless. So a lot of policies are there which are rhetoric. The reality is totally different. However, as I said earlier, it's a beautiful accountability that belongs to everyone. We cannot say that the organization should do everything or the government should do everything. It has to be reciprocal. So what are we putting back into the kete as, for example, members of an organization, because we belong to an organization? So belonging really means being included. You can have representation, which could be diversity, as we have in, people measure gender, people measure ethnicity, sexual orientation, where people record it, indigenous peoples, Pacifica peoples. But it's much more than that. How do you progress people in careers? How do you ensure that, for example, top management boards are still very white, very male-oriented, and where they are with gender, with more people with gender, it's again primarily white women. So I think we really have to delve deeper into seeing how do we include people who are diverse, not necessarily only because they are diverse, but how can we be more open to competencies and skills that diversity brings along?
I like how you bring up reciprocity, because then it's not just the board having all the power to offer for people to be included. And Paula, I see you nodding as well. So what are the policies that actually aren't just rhetoric, but make a difference?
I think there are a number of things that that we need to look at, and just to build on the points made by Edwina. So if I sort of think about this from a disability lens, and I think about the social model of disability, which says I'm not disabled by the particular impairment that I have, but rather it's the way in which society organizes itself and constructs itself and builds itself that creates disablement. And so when you translate that into the workplace, as a really good example for this conversation, it's about looking at recruitment policies and the culture of the organisation, making sure that when organisations are thinking about recruitment, that they're actually quite deliberate in thinking about who do we need in our organisation to make sure that we are really reflecting the people that we serve or our customer base, and being quite deliberate about that. And so again, thinking in the disability context, you know, do people put up their ads around recruitment in PDF only, or you know, do they only run interview processes, or actually are they much more open to having recruitment processes that will encourage a range of people to apply? So I think there are some really concrete things there. And then I think inside organisations, it's about creating that space to make sure that, you know, voices are able to be heard. And I think one of the things that, you know, Edwina, you touched on is that often that organisations can feel like they need some tools around the how. And I think that people don't need to feel that they have to start from scratch. You know, there's great evidence around a lot of this. And again, from the disability, you know, perspective, there are some great resources to tap into. There's the Government's Accessibility Guide and Lead Toolkit, which are both on the Ministry of Social Development's website. You know, if boards need convincing about the strength of diversity in their organisation, then the Diversity Works New Zealand website has some great tools. There's the Accessibility Tick program that can help organisations think about how to become inclusive. So I think really, you know, utilising some of those resources, Stacey, are really important, and being really deliberate that diversity actually is a strategy, because you know, there are 24% of New Zealand's population that are disabled. And why would you not want a quarter of the population to be part of your organisation? And, you know, 24% of the population is your customer base. So why would you not want to ensure you can serve it well? So I'll stop for there, Stacey.
And I don't want to miss the opportunity to clarify if people are wondering what a PDF does in terms of excluding people. When you were saying that if you just offer a job description by PDF, explain what would be better.
So PDFs are really difficult for people who are blind or have low vision. And so Word documents are able to be read with machine readable technology that many blind people use. So it's just really thinking about how do I make my information really accessible for people.
Nurain, what have you seen as concrete steps that are seen as commercially beneficial as well? Because sometimes people think that they're making a sacrifice, I guess. So what are some concrete steps that are mutually beneficial?
Absolutely. I think there's different levels that we need to think about when we think about organisational diversity. We've talked a lot about what like Paula said, there's some really concrete things that you could put into the recruitment process as you start thinking about bringing in diverse individuals into the organisation. What I speak about a lot of the time is that you have that recruitment and that rhetoric that Edwina's mentioned previously, where we are wanting diversity and we're wanting to attract diversity into an organisation, but then we kind of get really complacent once the individuals are there. So that thinking long term about that pipeline and ensuring that when individuals are there, they're very well supported. So this can be through making sure that the culture, you know, if it has been a really non-diverse organisation, making sure that the culture can evolve in a safe way, making sure that there are spaces for those conversations. These are really soft things, but you can be quite deliberate about it. One thing that I've found that really useful is when organisations put those in their performance review for all staff, and that means that that becomes part of their performance review, and it's a conversation that people can have as something that's really important to the organisation. One thing I want to mention that can't, for me as someone who is within a corporate organisation, but also speaks to corporate, that we all need to be quite brave about those conversations and really acknowledge that the discomfort of having unconscious biases. We all have them, I have them. So being quite brave and acknowledging that we all do, but then being able to move past that to have conversation and understand that each individual isn't defined by the external factors or what you present as, but also the nuance of the individual stories.
Yeah, that's a really good point. Is there anyone else here who admits they have individual biases? I mean, we all do. So this is why we have these continuing conversations and quite detailed and deep conversations. That's why I wanted to ask you, Edwina, what is the weight on the individual that Nurain mentioned as being the one person who has to carry diversity in a workplace? What is that cultural load like for that individual?
I'd like to respond to your question, Stacey, by saying that every organization and societies as well have a micro level, the individual, the meso level, the organization, and the macro level, the government, society. And I think I'd like to speak about systemic diversity. Not systemic racism, because the three, the micro, the meso, and the macro merge together. They are not separate. So when we think of culture, it's an individual's culture, but again, I cannot be miniaturized by seeing me only as one-dimensional. For example, as a woman, as a mother, as a poet, as an educator, as a professor, I'm much more than that. I could be a sister, a daughter, a follower of a particular religion, etc. So all that is me at a micro level. And I can, as an individual, display micro generosities as well as microaggressions. And that's something we've got to guard against in looking at diversity. So yes, as you correctly said, all of us are biased in various ways. But awareness of, for example, the tools that Paula mentioned, or what Nurain said, talking about performance management and performance appraisal, or individual development plans, seeing that one engages with the aspect of diversity. But more than that, what's the accountability? So we've known about diversity, I'm going to say forever. But what are we doing about it? So for example, in one of the Nordic countries, they said you have to have 40% of women on your boards. And they gave them a certain time frame. In Poland, for example, you have to employ a certain percentage of people who are disabled if your organization is of a particular size. So these are government or systemic diversity measures which encourage or incentivize people, whether they are boards, whether they are councils, whether they are organizations, or whether they are individuals. And I think that's really what New Zealand needs. We are rather hesitant to take these kinds of steps, believing that in good faith, everyone's going to act wonderfully well. But things change so fast, and we cannot put everything on the individual, to go back to the question that you asked. So it is a mix of individual, society, and organization. I mean, for the lockdown, if we didn't have a prime minister who said, we are all in lockdown, we are at this particular level, don't move out, perhaps we wouldn't have done what needed to be done unless we were systemically told, this is where we are. So it has to be a mix. And therefore, yes, the burden is there on individuals, but an individual is also a board member. An individual is also a leader or a TV presenter, or, you know, a myriad of different things. And I think that's what we tend to forget. When push comes to shove, we say, let's think of the individual. What is the individual doing? So that's really why I say it is a beautiful accountability. And I'm pushing that word because, again, we do wonderful things in New Zealand, but do we measure them? Are we really accountable for them?
Kia ora. And Nurain, I like how you added as well that you need to support at a micro level people who are in there and probably quite lonely at times. So when you bring in this idea, Edwina, of macro innovations, I guess, Nurain and Paula, do you have ideas or visions of what that could look like? Really accessible macro changes that we could make? Either of you?
Go ahead, Paula.
Look, I think that just building on what Edwina said, and it's pretty hard to top that answer. It was so informative, just in a really great framework to think it through. I think from my perspective, we do need to see diversity as that collective responsibility as a country to ensure that we embrace diversity and inclusion, and that we take an equitable approach to things. I think that the three aspects are actually quite important and work in tandem with each other. I think that that sometimes in an organization, you can have a person who is brought into the organization to advise on a specific area of diversity, and in that case, that individual is seen as the go-to person on disability, for example. And in that circumstance, it's kind of okay. But when we hire people to bring rich diversity to our organisation, it is really important that just because a person identifies in a particular way, they're not the go-to person on everything to do with a particular population group, because actually that burden is unfair, and I think inappropriate in the context that we need to build our capacity, our awareness and our understanding at all levels in the organisation. And ultimately that's about leadership within the organisation, and making sure that leaders are really not just talking the talk but walking the talk, and making sure that that they're expressing those inclusive and diverse messages. And I think making sure that there is space within an organisation for different voices to come through. So those are a couple of points that I would add to Edwina's really helpful and insightful comments.
Nurain, I saw that you were nodding in agreement when we talk about one person having to take the load. And I guess when we talk about macro innovations that can counter that, what are some that you see either happening or could ideally happen?
Absolutely. I was nodding because it's so often a spot that I find myself in, and it's not something that I shy away from, but it certainly is a burden. And I can see that for others like me who are intersectional women of colour as well. In terms of macro innovations, I really go to the fact that we can all help each other, and thinking about when, especially in a corporate environment, we think about competing with each other, but flipping the narrative to say that there is enough sunshine for everybody. So leaving the ladder down, making sure that the pipeline is coming through. The other, as Edwina mentioned, things like quotas really help, because it's a bit of a kick for us to actually take action sooner rather than later, and being really quite courageous in saying that. I had a recent conversation where we were talking about who comes first. Do we wait until we're gender equal before we think about other types of diversity? But actually it's not. We're all humans, and we're all people who deserve the equal opportunity to to have our voices heard, but also take that space. So really thinking about what are the key things like pay transparency or quotas that can really serve as that, I guess, accelerant. And we definitely, as Edwina said, New Zealand is quite complacent sometimes and can be a bit scared. But I think, especially with how 2020 has gone and the global Black Lives Matter movements and things like that, I think we are now in a time where we can be quite courageous about those things.
Edwina, that leads me to ask you about self-assessment for companies, and also that discomfort if people feel like they are relinquishing a space for the sake of diversity?
Yes, I think we are all diverse, whether one is white, male, woman, of color, child, adult, whatever. Sexual orientation, differently abled, different political views, etc. And I'd like to quote here Whakatoki, he waka e kanoa. We are all in this together, but there is more than one interpretation for that. So we rise together, we fall together. And I think that is critical. So organizations cannot pick up all aspects of diversity. They can decide which ones they need to focus on and build on that. So what are the pivot points that organizations need to look at and pivot on? Because then they will be able to measure. Otherwise, there are too many things to look at. And I'd also like to emphasize, while yes, New Zealand is fairly complacent in how it moves forward in diversity, even though if we look at the Global Gender Gap Report, we are number 6, we've gone up in terms of the global ranking. But that's not yet good enough. And so what do we do differently? How are organizations incentivizing their individuals, their teams to look at diversity, to have groups who are diverse, to have heads of department who are differently abled, who are diverse? But don't get me wrong, I'm not saying for diversity we need to be aggressive. What I am saying is we need to be assertive. We need to navigate, negotiate, and be diplomatic in how we move forward. Therefore, it has to be a rationally compassionate strategies. So there is rationality, so the cognitive aspect, there is compassion, because everyone doesn't have the same intellectual capabilities, but it has to be strategic, in other words, long term. I think in New Zealand, we also do a number of things on an ad hoc basis. And therefore, we find it hard to measure. So if we have long-term strategies, and long-term could be a year, it could be 3 years, it could be 5 years. The Chinese say plan for 7 generations. Mm-hmm. I mean, our Tangata Whenua say think of the Mokopuna for 7 generations. And there is a Japanese saying that fall down 7 times, get up 8. So we practice, we try, we experiment, we do what, for example, Nurain mentioned, have these conversations which are difficult. But life is not meant to be a bed of roses. And I think it's important on each of us to take that accountability, a word I'm using frequently, and say, today, within my span of control, what can I do differently? So every day is an opportunity to do things differently. And I'd like to see it that way, so we don't feel hopeless when we think of Black Lives Matter or when we think of people dying of COVID, because whatever we might say, while New Zealand, we are lucky in terms of how we've handled COVID, we are all interconnected. Whether it's climate change, and we are losing our diversity over there. Whether we look at ethnic cleansing, for example, again, it's diversity that's being lost because one group thinks they are more dominant than another. Whether we look at religious diversity, whether it's Sunni, Shias, Ahmadiyas, the range of different groups. So that's where we look at, and again, a term that one of my co-panelists used was our humanity. But we do need the structural aspects, the systemic aspects of diversity to contain us so that we are fiercely disciplined without being aggressive in what we do.
Kia ora. And Paula, I know advocacy is part of your role. So is that what do you agree with that in terms of strategy and what advocacy needs to look like?
I think one of the points I'd make is this idea of intersectionality around our identities is really important. And, very few people identify as sort of, one identity. And so I think it's really important, therefore, when we think about diversity within organisations, that we actually don't say, well, until we've got it right for gender diversity, we're not going to move on to the next thing or the next thing, because actually we bring our whole selves to an organisation, and that intersectionality, I think, is really, really important. And I think that organisations need to embrace that. One of the things that I find really disheartening to hear, and with a number of organisations that I talk with, is when they say to me that we'll get to disability, Paula. And my challenge really is, well, if you're not doing disability, you're not doing diversity. One, because of the population of disabled people in New Zealand is 24%. And secondly, because we don't just bring one identity to the workplace, we bring multiple identities. You can't just, line up a set of population groups in some sort of sequential order, I don't think, and work your way through that. Absolutely acknowledge that it can feel daunting for organisations to feel that somehow they've got to get it right. And I really like the idea of actually just try some things. And there are tools out there. There are a range of organisations to really help, and some really good tools available. Certainly in the disability space. And I think people often will talk to me about this sense that somehow disability we get to disability last because it's the hardest. And actually, I really don't think that's the case, given the tools that are out there, the expertise that exists, and the expertise from disabled people ourselves. So yeah, look, tricky, but I think you do absolutely agree you've got to have a very deliberate focus around these things.
But it's not perhaps linear, is what you're saying. And Nurain, would you agree with that we have to sequentially decide which diversity we will do first and then have time for the others?
Yeah, absolutely. And I would really challenge that narrative or that idea, because I feel that that's coming from the inherently, if I can say this, the inherently racist system that we live in, and the kind of discrimination that already exists within the system. And so that is where that is coming from. So if we're not challenging that at the outset of tackling diversity and being more inclusive, then we're failing before we even begin. So I think that's what I mean by being quite courageous, really breaking out of that system and thinking outside of what we know, because there is so much, so many other ways of conceiving of that.
So how do we clear a slate? If we recognize that we have an issue, how do we restart in our organizations? Edwina, you had a ironic look on your face, so I think that you have an idea.
I think a lot of these aspects, and I'll just put in some quotes, for example. Rumi, for example, the Persian poet, said, "Sell your cleverness and buy bewilderment." So we need to keep trying things and not feel that we are so clever, we've done it before, it's wonderful. But the world is changing so fast. So, and this links up with what Nurain said and with what Paula said. So you've got a host of different tools, techniques, expertise of people, wonderful books, journal articles, magazines, which talk about diversity and tell you how to. It's very easy to write them off because there are no simple answers. They all intersect, intertwine, or we live in a woven universe. And how do we encourage that? And therefore, trying out different things becomes very, very critical. I think also, and if I refer to a story from the Bible about Cain and Abel, Cain was asked about his brother Abel, and he said, "Am I my brother's keeper?" We are all the keepers of each other, because that's the way we are connected. And I think if ethically, if morally, however old-fashioned that might sound. I think these are the core values that we need to have, coupled with the rationally compassionate strategies that we need to have. All of us make mistakes. We have to be able to be brave enough to say, yes, I've made a mistake. Let's get feedback on this, and genuine feedback, not a fait accompli, and then move forward from that. So this ties in with trying out different things. And that's why I said about Rumi, sell your cleverness and buy bewilderment. And also, I mean, we don't know how much time we have on this earth, right? So one of the indigenous people from the US said, what is life? It's a firefly in the night, a shadow which runs across the grass and loses itself in the sunset. So we are given the opportunity every day to make a difference. And I think this is something that really has to be looked at, particularly by people in top management, because they are the ones who set the tone. But again, it is reciprocal. And that's why, what do we each put back into the kete every day for the privilege of being on this earth?
Kia ora. And I like the diversity of your references as well. You've gone from whakatauki Māori to Rumi, and it just goes to show the benefits of participating in lots of different worldviews. And when we talk about bewilderment, I love how children think. And my daughter, when she was 10, she said to me that someone was disincluded. And I said the word in English is actually excluded. And she said, no, it's different. Disincluded is when you want to include someone, but you don't know how to. So that person is disincluded. And I thought I knew exactly what that feeling was. So how do we include people without them, when people are worrying about disinclusion? Nurain, what is a really authentic way to engage? Because I know sometimes I've been engaged in a way that people have literally said, oh, we need more diversity, so we have to get you to do it.
It's a great question, and I love that. Your daughter has so much wisdom at 10 years old. I love that, absolutely. For me, the first step, as I've mentioned before, it's really acknowledging that we all have biases and being able to overcome that first thought that has been ingrained in us, to move to seeing the individual in front of us or the group of people in front of us with curiosity, but a real curiosity that has no assumptions. And that can be difficult, but if it's that acknowledgement that when you meet someone new that might not look like you, it's really coming to it as really trying to understand their worldview. How can I be as open as possible to allowing them to tell me what their story is, without making assumptions. There are so many interactions that I've had here in Aotearoa where, as a migrant who looks different, where people make so many assumptions at the outset. So it's really being able to have that conversation with curiosity and being really open to, whether it's being challenged on your own views, but being really open and with kindness. I think kindness has been a real theme of 2020. And I think if we can approach each other with that, that's really important. And then translating that into leadership and the cultures that we create. I think I've always really appreciated the Te Ao Māori way of welcoming people into spaces. And so allowing that cultural diversity to kind of, I guess, put in our kete that we can acknowledge people in that way where we're not putting people into boxes.
Kia ora, because Paula, that I see that's an issue for the community whaitake. So in terms of my whānau, my brother-in-law is profoundly deaf and has been from birth, but I see his strengths that we all marvel at. He has much better attention to detail and can spot people in a crowd faster than we can. He can dance better than other members of the whānau because he can feel vibrations. He's great at impersonations of people because he's got such good awareness and observation. So what are ways that we can welcome people in that feel authentic and that honour their abilities and differences?
Absolutely. So I think, we sort of talk about that being that sort of strength-based approach. What do people bring to the conversation or to the work, and really looking at those benefits and advantages. And I think that's where diversity helps out, generally. I think that, part of, from a disability perspective, it is about people learning and being more aware about disability and the context within which we live, and people understanding about how we have this collective responsibility to remove barriers to enable participation of everybody, including disabled people. And I think, creating those welcoming spaces, I think learning New Zealand Sign Language, learning about the disability language, and making sure that we're allowing the voices of disabled people to be at the table, as part of decision making, and really being quite deliberate actually about letting people in. And I think that's a really important way forward, because one of the things we all sort of touched on in our opening conversation about the benefits of diversity is that it brings these different approaches and different ways of thinking, and those different strengths that you talked about in the case of your brother. We all have strengths to bring to the table, and it's just about looking at how we recruit, looking at the spaces physically that we design in our workplaces and in our organisation, and talking with people about what they see as the barriers to participating, and then really trying to break those down.
It leads nicely into a question that we've had, and thank you to everyone watching who's offering their thoughts and questions. It says, diversity and inclusion in businesses and workplaces sometimes feels like it's the new corporate social responsibility. How can we make diversity and inclusion substantively embedded in the structure of our workforce instead of a nice to have? Edwina, I think I've heard similar words coming from you already, so would you like to speak to that?
Yes, thank you. I'd like to mention 3 points. The first point being, and this in some ways picks up what both Paula and Nurain have said and what you have said as well, Stacey. First of all, we have to be able to move beyond people's visible diversity discriminators. So, for example, you see me, I'm a scholar of color, but I'm much more than that. Or you see a person who's differently abled, or you see a person with a burqa. They are much more than only their religion. And I say only in the nicest possible way. So moving beyond visible diversity discriminators. Second, honoring the fact that if you are a token, that you're grateful for being a token, but then you make a difference because you have an opportunity to be at the table, rather than poo-pooing it and saying, oh, I'm just a token, I was picked up for this or picked up for that. So the fact that you're picked up, how do you make a difference? And the third thing I'd like to mention is research shows that of course, we can't do things serially. I mean, we do it serially, but we are meant to do it cyclically rather than, sequentially. That diversity can really be embedded into organizations if we look at the prosperity gap. Rather than talking of the poverty gap, I'd like to talk of the prosperity gap. And for example, therefore, in recruitment, of course, PDF files, like you mentioned, they need to be in Word documents, but where are we putting our advertisements? How are we contacting people? That becomes critical. Who are the people we are having on our interview panels? If, for example, a white male was going to be interviewed by all Chinese women, how would he feel? Just as a case in point. Okay, so that's recruitment. Then do we measure, once people are recruited, their career progression? Therefore, we are embedding these into the organization norms. So it becomes more than rhetoric. Are we openly talking about career progression? When people don't do well, how do we support them so that they do well? But if they don't, maybe they don't fit in. What alternatives are we providing for them? So it's not a one size fits all, because culture is contextual. Diversity is contextual. And I think that is really important. But holding people accountable. One can also have diversity awards, as for example, Diversity Works has, for in New Zealand. I think that's important because then people work towards getting certain things. So saying that in an organization, strategically, let's say in 3 years or in 5 years, we are going to apply for a diversity award. Whether we get it or not, that's the end result. But the process itself makes a difference. And as Nurain said, holding people accountable in terms of the performance appraisal. So starting a conversation, talking about different things really makes a difference. So that hopefully will reduce the fear of senior people, because it is in a document saying, talk about diversity. So I think those are, a range of options that can be there. And also in exit interviews, why do people leave? Talking about why they leave, and then taking it full circle. So you give closure to why people have left, and then you incorporate that into strategic documents which are dynamic. So they are not set in stone. And I mean, New Zealand has a wonderful track record when you look at the rainbow tick. When you look at, we were the first in the world for suffrage. Auckland is one of the most diverse cities in the world. The fact that we have allowed this diversity to come in is wonderful. Now business organizations need to be able to use that diversity. And that's where the recruitment, the selection, all that comes in, and the training as well. How do we train people? What are we training them in? Of course, we have to train them with different computer systems, for example, but different languages. But what else? How do we show them how to be compassionate, how to be disciplined? And this is my area of expertise, so I could, and I've written volumes about it. I'd just like to add one more thing, please, Stacey, which is organizations can say, we give you 1 or 2 days in the year to work voluntarily with groups who are diverse. So we are legitimizing diversity through this. And I think that's something we need to do, rather than saying, if you would like to, work with, let's say, people who are experiencing domestic violence, so certain ethnic groups experience it more than others, for example, or, work with, go to a home which has the elderly and sing to them. So encouraging these things, or go and play with children who are, have various kind of issues. And I think the organizations can legitimize these things. Again, they shy away from them. So we have the tools, we have the techniques. We need the will to
and
do
the courage. The courage, as Nurain mentioned, because an exit interview could be quite revealing, and you have to be ready to hear it, I guess, because it does make me think of people that I know have left for reasons that they probably never fully explained. Nurain, I'm going to ask you a question that I'm asking you because you mentioned about tangata whenua and how you participate in as a migrant. I will offer my perspective as well, because no doubt you're saying, why aren't you saying this, Māori person? But the question is, what does treaty-based settlement mean to you? And I take that to mean, how do we participate in diversity as Māori? And to be honest, because as tangata whenua, sometimes I ask people to consider that being included because of our diversity sometimes feels like being invited to a party that's been going for many years, and finally they say, you know what, you should come to this party, it's actually at your house, so I think I see the challenge, and I think migrant communities have a very good understanding of what it feels like to come into Aotearoa and your perception of what a treaty-based settlement looks like, and also, are we near it by your perception?
Could you please clarify what do you mean by near it?
Near something that looks like a treaty partnership in action, I guess, in terms of our diversity and how Māori participate in terms of diversity and inclusion. The question as it was written said settlement, which I don't think we're actually talking about land and assets being returned to iwi, but more in terms of what diversity for tangata whenua looks like, or how you've seen it as a migrant.
Sure. And what I can speak to is my experience, obviously, and my experience of the communities that I've been a part of. I don't think I can say what inclusion has been for a Māori, and the tangata whenua friends and communities that I have participated in have particular views. So I will probably leave it up to them to share that. For me, where I'll start personally, for me, it's as a migrant to the land that is Indigenous land, it's really, really important for me to understand that is where I am now, and really understand and acknowledge that, and honour that, and understand what that means to be a migrant on this land. And I can, as a migrant, be adding my voice or my influence, however much I have it, so that we can have a more just and equitable outcomes for Māori and tangata whenua communities around New Zealand, and really across the world wherever I do have a voice. I think on a really personal level, understanding and having conversations with Māori communities has really allowed me to feel a sense of belonging with Aotearoa as well, and really understand where we come from as a land. I think, as most minority communities in New Zealand, there is a long way to go, but I think, like you said, it's a party that's been going on for a number of years, and there is so much more that we could do. And I think personally as a migrant, but also with the migrant communities that I engage in conversation with, we really feel like we want to be partners in influencing those decisions as well.
Kia ora, tēnā koe. That's a beautiful answer, actually. I will refer to that in the future too. So tēnā koe. I will direct this question to you, Paula. It's about allyship. What is the most effective form of diversity and inclusion allyship you've seen that amplifies the message of diversity and inclusion without overstepping? I guess the interpretation of overstepping was personal, but yeah, what is some allyship you've seen being very effective?
I think the bottom line really is the first step that people can take is actually working with the group who it is you're seeking to be an ally with. So again, in this case, disabled people, it's about really, engaging with disabled people's organisations, disabled people generally, and actually talking through how you can be a really, really good ally. And, I think picking up on Edwina's point about, diversity awards and things, they can showcase where organisations have done that really well and worked, with disabled people and others to, increase employment and other opportunities. I think, obviously, sort of as Nurain nicely showed, not talking for a group that you don't necessarily identify with is really important. So I think the starting point is always talking with the population group. I just wanted to be slightly cheeky and answer the question as well around that you asked earlier, around this idea that diversity is seen as this sort of new thing that people just must do. And I just sort of wanted to add a couple of points to that, if I might, which is, I think it is really, really important that we do keep talking about and demonstrating the benefits of diversity, and then being really deliberate in our strategies around that. And I think really, really key, and we haven't talked a lot about this, but it is about challenging the myths and assumptions, not just that we have about, we have ourselves, but actually just sort of collectively, and in the disability space, I see this a lot, particularly with employers who make some assumptions that it might be too expensive, that people will take more sick leave, that you know, they don't know how to accommodate people's needs. And in actual fact, you know, what the evidence shows is that actually, you know, every employee has particular needs, be it caring for an older parent, be it, you know, parenting and needing different hours. And so it really just is about working with individuals. You know, challenging assumptions around, you know, it being expensive. You know, it's not particularly more expensive at all. And, you know, there are some really good stats about disabled people having less ACC claims and, you know, staying with organisations longer. So some really tangible benefits. And so I think we really must be courageous in challenging some of those myths and assumptions. Sorry, that was two answers to two questions, Stacey.
And we haven't got much longer, unfortunately, because first of all, I'm really enjoying the kōrero with all of you, but also because the questions are so good. So just briefly, I'll have to ask, Edwina, I might direct this to you. Do you see a connection we've been having about this conversation about diversity and inclusion and the rise in social media? And if so, has the conversation been positively or negatively impacted by social media?
I think it's difficult to give a direct yes, no answer because it's complex. But I think it's important that we try to look, and again, I refer to what Paula said as well as Nurain, to look at the glass half full rather than all the time looking at the glass half empty and grumbling and feeling entitled, because for every right there is a duty. And I would like to pick up one word, which is kaitiakitanga. I think that's so important and critical, whether we look at us being trustees or guardians of ourselves, of each other, because we all have wairua, and whether it's you know, animals or plants or stones or the earth or each other. And that for me is really key to diversity, and that's key to how we respond in social media as well.
We have a final question about empathy. How do we encourage individuals within an organisation who lack empathy to embrace diversity? And we've only got 3 minutes left, but Nurain, I see, you know, sometimes people get a smile on when they know that that kind of triggers a recognition. So when people lack empathy, how do we engage?
I'm not sure I'm the right person for this because my answer in my head was being quite cheeky. When I facilitate a lot of trainings on diversity and inclusion, particularly for an international audience, and one of the ideas that I always present is the philosopher Karl Popper's idea that the paradox of intolerance, which is that in order to be a tolerant society, we have to be intolerant of those that are intolerant. And so coming back to that courage, it is to create a space where we do not allow for people who, you know, either peddle in hate speech or discriminate really openly. However, it's also coming from a place of empathy ourselves to not, you know, we do have this idea that if someone doesn't follow the rules of what we see collectively as society or a particular microculture, then that we exclude them immediately. But it's really coming from a place of kindness initially to invite them into the conversation. I say, don't call people out, call them in as well, because it is really, it's really perpetuating exclusion if we are to do that for people who may not be displaying those behaviours. But at the end of the day, if people are really dug in, I really feel that we should be being quite intolerant of those that are intolerant, because for me and the community, my Muslim community in particular, we've seen what could happen if we are to allow those views to be there, and that has been quite horrific, and it's changed the way that I feel about being in New Zealand. So it can be quite a tangible outcome. So really being quite courageous about that.
Tēnā koe. Actually, that's a great way to end our kōrero, but I hope that it's only just started some whakaaro, some ideas that will be brewing and will make a difference. And I do believe that that is the opportunity in front of us now, thanks to your fantastic kōrero. Tēnā koutou katoa. I will now just close all the energy of this kōrero. Ko ngā tapu o tēnei kōrero, e nei kōrero katoa ka whakairia, kia wātea ai te ara, kia turiki whakatahai, kia turiki whakatahai. Haumi e, hui e, tae ki e. Tēnā koutou katoa. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you, Stacey.
Thanks, everybody.
Yes,
Thank
thank
you.
everyone.
I feel we could have talked for hours.
Yeah.
Yes.
Good.
Yes.